Welcome to Building Better Businesses, an ABA podcast. Learn firsthand from business owners who've built successful ABA businesses. Utilize proven techniques and strategies to help your practice thrive. This is Building Better Businesses, an ABA podcast with Jonathan Mueller.
My name is Jonathan Mueller. I'm the host of Building Better Businesses in ABA podcast, and I am thrilled to have two bright and shining points and mentors in my life today. Let me tee both of them up. Lani Fritts has been the founder and CEO of two national ABA organizations, Cadient and Trumpet Behavioral Health. He's also a board member of the Council of Autism Service Providers. He has an economics degree from Georgetown and received his MBA at Stanford Graduate School of Business. Lani, welcome to the pod.
Thank you, Jonathan. It's always fun to hang out with you. I take a lot of energy from you.
Right back at you, dude. And Dr. Rohit Verma holds his PhD in economics from the University of Pennsylvania. He's been in the ABA field for more than 10 years, serving as CFO and corporate strategy roles at Trumpet, and most recently as a chief strategy and revenue officer at Cadient. He started his professional career as a management consultant at A.T. Kearney and subsequently in high tech in Silicon Valley. Rohit, welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here with the two of you. And I have to say that it's you've been phenomenally successful given the challenges you had starting off with the two of us as mentors, or me anyway. So well done.
Yeah. Oh man, so self-deprecating, Rohit. Well, and let's turn to you because you literally are probably one of the most important people in my career who has guided my career development. I mean, you were my first manager at A.T. Kearney in 1998 in Chicago, and but for you, I would not have ended up in Silicon Valley in the early 2000s, which means I wouldn't have met Lani Fritts, which means I would not be in autism in this day. So, I really can't quite communicate the power of this conversation to me. And I want to start, Rohit, by asking you a question, and actually seeing if you remember a paper that we wrote, or I should say I supported and wrote with you at A.T. Kearney back in the around 99, 2000, that was looking at Amazon versus eBay and who is going to be more successful long-term. And if I remember correctly, we picked eBay. Though for important reasons. I think Amazon at that point was just selling books and eBay was actually creating a marketplace. So I'm not trying to justify that, although I know to listeners, it probably sounds crazy that we picked Amazon. But Rohit, why is it so hard to predict winners in any given industry?
Well, this does bring back some embarrassing memories. But if I remember correctly, you had opted for Amazon and I pushed both of us in the direction of eBay. So the fault was more mine, and so you have to think back and try and justify those kinds of decisions. But I think what we liked about eBay was the fact that it was building a marketplace, right? And there's a goodness in building a marketplace. So the bigger you are, the stronger your position becomes and the harder you are to dislodge. While at that point in time, Amazon was simply selling books, right? And so and we look at it now, what is eBay is like a $25 billion market cap company and Amazon is more than 40 times that. So we kind of whiffed on that. I guess you can't legislate for a Jeff Bezos for one, right? And so that kind of leadership is phenomenal. And then the other thing is that, what are the reasons of success? I'm sure that Tom's written about it, and kind of in my naive judgment, they had a founding principle that they really believe in, which is customer satisfaction, and then just like a relentless pursuit of operations. So that and moving on to adjacent markets, I think, are some of the things that make them stand out, which I think has, I'm not really answering your question, but I think it does have implications for our industry, right? Where we want to have that mix of client service, high quality outcomes, as well as operational efficiency. So yeah, if there's some takeaways from Amazon, it's those 2 or 3 things, but obviously very challenging to pick winners.
Well said. Well, Lani, I want to turn to you around I love your insights on what our field's going to look like in 5 years, and to this question of winners, what are going to be the key characteristics of organizations who end up as winners?
Well, let's think about some of the things that you just talked about with Amazon and eBay, and then think about what's happened in our field over the last 3 or 4 years. If someone could have predicted in 2019, the person who predicted that there was going to be a pandemic probably has survived and thrived far greater than of any other organization. And so the point is, circumstances change, and sometimes very abruptly, right? So if you think about our field, 3 years ago, 4 years ago, nobody really thought hiring direct line staff was the constraint. Everybody saw this substantial demand, and BCBAs were the constraint, and there was this assumption that if you need RBTs, you just hire more, right? And that has completely turned on its head overnight. I mean, if you think about just over the last 18 months to 2 years. So then if you say, well, how is that going to impact the field for the next 5 years? We are going to be labor constrained. It's going to be a headwind for probably all of those 5 years and beyond, which then says, well, we've got to innovate service models. And I think that's going to be a combination of a number of different factors. We will finally, I think, see better, more effective use of digital therapeutics. I think that that's got to be part of the solution to serving this community. And I think that organizations are going to have to really understand what good culture is, and in order to survive. And I think the payers are going to have to rethink the reimbursement models substantially. And first and foremost, to keep their networks intact, they're going to have to recognize that the cost has just shot up, it's gone through the roof over the last 2 years. So reimbursement rates are always lagging, but they're going to have to change and increase. But I think that it can't just be that. And any providers that are just sort of hammering at the payer door to say, woe is me, labor, you've got to pay me more, I think are probably not going to be the winners. The winners are going to be the people that look at it holistically and think about broad sets of solutions. And so I would say, those 3 things: partnership with payers, use of technology, digital therapeutics likely as part of it, and get your culture in order, because there are plenty of options for everybody, and they will vote with their feet if you're not a great place to work.
It's so powerful, Lani. And you know what it brings to mind to your initial question around who could have predicted the pandemic? And we can't predict these black swan events, right? That what's the book? I mean, the book is called Black Swans by, I think, Nasib Talib. But one of the things that you taught me at Trumpet, and an exercise we engaged in, was there's an annual strategic planning session or annual strategic planning work that gets done, but there's a check-in quarterly on that. Almost it's like we're constantly coming back to saying, what factors do we see in the environment, in the economic environment, the field, and the payer environment that might influence that? I don't know. It feels like organizations who can be nimble enough to respond, because we can't predict everything that will happen, are really critical. And I think a good strategic planning session, you told me, always starts with pick a big vision, like Kennedy's, we're going to put a man on the moon in 10 years. Everyone can get behind that. But is that I don't think I've ever asked you that question. Is that sort of intentionality around strategic planning something that you just there must have been hours and hours that you spent in getting ready to make those kinds of sessions successful for the team?
I mean, that's the role of the CEO. It's the role of leadership, as part of a C-suite team, is to think about the broader set of contingencies that you are facing or will be facing, and to align the organization around that mission and vision, and reinforce the mission and vision with living values every day, and then have the execution chops to respond and react when things don't quite go the way the plan was first intended. So I do think that it is intentionality, and I think it's critical to have an operating framework so within the context of that framework, you can respond quickly and react when things, when the asteroid hits, right? And you think about the pandemic, it's like it's the black swan, it's, the asteroid strike, it's whatever you want to call it. And I suspect organizations that had no plan had a lot harder time sort of ginning up and gearing up operationally to adjust and change. A lot of people who poo-poo the amount of time and energy into strategic planning will say, "Wow, but everything's going to change anyway." It's like, well, okay, if you, that's true. So the plan gives you the framework to understand how to respond and what levers to pull. So I do think it's a critical function of organizational leadership in business, in not-for-profit, in whatever endeavor you're leading.
Yeah, well said. Was it Eisenhower's quote that I'm going to totally botch, but it's like, no plan survives the battlefield, and yet planning is indispensable. So, I mean, if in organizations, like, just if you're not strategic planning right now, like, get it started. And I love your point around C-suite and CEOs helping point the organization in the right direction, and then having those, executional chops to make it happen and pivot as needed. Well, Rohit, what about, I want to think about the macro environment, because there's a lot that's happening right now around rising interest rates and just talks of recession. I mean, at some point we're bound to face a recession. This is like a when, not if. What would a recession mean for ABA providers?
Yeah, and this connects with the conversation we're having now. But it's also interesting to kind of think of it in terms of current trends, right? I mean, if you look at inflation, right, and like in the last decade, right, starting 2010, it's kind of been around 2%-ish, give or take a little, right? And then it jumped to about 5% in 2021. It's now at 9%. So that's actually a massive force of what's happening right now. And interestingly enough, when you think in terms of unemployment, right, the unemployment rate was about 10% at the beginning of the last decade, and gradually went down to about 3.5, which seemed relatively unsustainable, and the pandemic happened. But we're back at that. We're like around 3.6%. So like, what are the forces saying? So the forces is saying that and the other thing is, while the unemployment rate is close to where it was before the pandemic, the number of people employed, especially in places like industries like health and education, has come down, right? So the forces at play out here are, one, that there is a shortage of labor, as Lani pointed out, and then you got the inflationary pressure, which inevitably then puts pressure on wages. So you have this environment where wages are going up, right? And we have growth constrained because of labor shortages, people shortages. And as you point out, the almost inevitability of recession. So what would that mean, right? I mean, I think it takes a little bit of time for wages to kind of like get reined in, because inflation goes down. So presumably recession allows for that. So there might be some opportunity there. There might be some opportunity for growth to expand a little, because there might be more people looking for work. So net, it might not be that bad, right? I mean, it'll take a little bit of a while for the inflationary pressures to recede. But on the other hand, growth may be not as constrained. Like in a recession, you expect demand will go down, but on the other hand, supply is constrained as well. So it's hard to say on balance what's going to happen. So overall, I'm more worried about what the current trends are, and the impact of recession might alleviate some of these trends, might not. It's a little bit of a coin toss. Hard for me to say anyway. I don't know if you guys have a point of view with regard to that.
Well, I mean, I think that your point is.
Go ahead, Lani.
I think that your point is that this field has been relatively insulated from recessionary challenges in the past, other than people that rely on state budget money. That oftentimes has had some impact if state budgets get impacted. But in the healthcare world, it is essential medical services, and therefore, recession in and of itself doesn't necessarily impact the business environment or the demand side. On the other hand, more people looking for work probably does ease some of the upward pressure on labor. However, inflation is the countervailing force of that, which is, wages have to go up to offset inflation for a workforce. So maybe it won't be as impactful or as cyclical to other sectors, but we'll see.
Yeah, I mean, healthcare itself tends to be more recession, I won't say proof, but recession resistant, because people need services, whether the economy is good or not good. And I think part of the dynamic, you kind of alluded to this, Lani, is Medicaid or state funded programs. These will be a lagging factor, but in a recession, state coffers are not what they once were, and so budget cuts happen, which lead to rate declines and potential service restrictions and other things. And what feels important for an ABA owner is thinking about their payer mix, right? And if you are balanced between Medicaid and commercial and a variety of different payers within each of those, you can tend to insulate yourself just a little bit more from potential recession. Let's talk about the two of you did this seminal survey with CASP on utilization and profitability benchmarks across ABA providers. This just came out in May of this year, so it's like hot off the press. I was super fortunate to see all the findings, learn about those at ABAI. I know you all have been on a speaking tour of to talk about these, but this is powerful. This is the first survey, at least that I'm aware of, that's happened in our field. So Rohit, let's start. Can you just describe the survey methodology and framework you use to analyze these key operational and profitability benchmarks?
Yeah, for sure. And it's interesting you use the word seminal, because when I used that, Lani was like, "Oh no, it's not seminal." But
I'm just more understated. I thought it was a great piece of work. Let's put it that way.
So I think it's what it's exactly that thinking that led to the survey, right? Because at best in conversations, people provided anecdotal proof in terms of what operational efficiency benchmark should be, right? I mean, like, we always have conversations with companies and the people that we work with, or other members of the industry, in terms of what we should aspire to, but there was very little data out there in terms of what that number should be. And so a lot of this was based on this gap. So a lot of what drove this was based on the gap, and we thought it was super important to get that done. And so just in terms of the structure of it, right? I mean, it was important to kind of come up with a framework by which to measure operational metrics and measures of financial performance, right? Because it's very hard to compare one company versus another if you don't have that framework. And the framework that we decided on, which I think makes sense, is this 3-tier structure with the clinical director pyramid, or the clinical manager pyramid, right? And so 3 tiers being the clinical director, supervisors, and BTs, and smushing the supervisors into, including both BCBA supervisors as well as mid-tier supervisors. So what's good about that? One is it kind of covers all the key clinical participants. So you have a measure of everything that really should matter. And that's kind of like the reproducible unit, right? I mean, like, you can't necessarily reproduce just a supervisor's pyramid, because if you don't have a clinical director, or if there's only one clinical director, you aren't catching some of the potential efficiencies or inefficiencies. So it was that. Then it was a matter of just, okay, so what are the right metrics around it? And fundamentally, there are 2 kinds, right? One is to do with just the raw economics, right? And very simply, that is, what is the reimbursement, what is the wage rate, and the rest of it is operational metrics in and around that. So that's what we started off with. And our strong belief was there's just a handful, maybe 7 or 8 metrics, which should give you a fairly good kind of measure of how that unit is doing and what the gross margins associated with it are. And then the rest of it was a response. And so I know we talked to you and you responded, and appreciate that. Organizations such as CASP helped a lot. In the end, we got 44 respondents, which is a pretty solid group of respondents. I mean, if we think in terms of the future, it'd be great to have that level of response by region, because there's so many dynamics happening by each geographical region that you want to be more specific to. But yeah, so that was the basis of the survey and the framework that we used.
Lani, what was your biggest aha moment?
Well, I think the aha moment for me was the breadth of the distribution across the different results, the responses. So in other words, there was very, very high variability across similar organizations. Like if you hold one of the variables fixed, then like reimbursement rates, and then look at all those organizations that are sort of closely close in the reimbursement rate, but then look at their wage rates, it was highly variable what their wage rates were. So there was not a lot of correlation to reimbursement rate and wage rate, or vice versa. If you look at the way that the reimbursement worked across a wage category, there's massive distribution, and that was true across all of these different sort of variables that you might think would be more correlated. So that was interesting and surprising to me, and maybe it shouldn't be, because people operate in their own environment and they respond to the contingencies of their environment, right? And so without benchmarking, it's sort of hard to know what your goal should be, right? And I just read a post by Julie Zhu, who was a Acadian board member. She's phenomenal, and she's written some books on leadership. She used to be an executive at Facebook. But she described, the importance of measuring yourself against benchmarks of the highest performing organizations in your environment, and also the lowest performing organizations in your environment. And like, if you want to feel motivated, look at the benchmark of the highest performer. If you want to feel good about yourself, look at the benchmark of the lowest performer and where you sit. And then it was interesting. One of the people weighing in to her post suggested, well, the other benchmark would be yourself, right? Which is more of like a continuous improvement benchmark. But it's all about knowing where you sit, and maybe what the art of the possible is, and then figuring out how to make change to get to where you want to go. Set your goal high, set your vision high, and then you make the choices of how you get there. And the one thing I would say about the survey that I would love subsequent surveys to be able to do, which I'm sure a lot of people in our field will want, is adding some measures of clinical quality alongside of it, because we were very focused on the things that are the sort of productivity and financial results metrics. It would be great to be able to correlate that to really objective measures of quality. I think that's a deficiency in the field generally, is it's very hard. These are the types of things that are very objective and benchmarkable. Quality is not, because there's so many different ways that people try to define it today, or it's undefined. So I do think what would be interesting to see is, in the highest quartile of financial performance, would you also, if you held that fixed, would you also see massive variability in quality? And I think there's a perception in the field that if you're making a lot of money, or you have a high profit margin, your quality must be terrible. I suspect that we will also see there are companies that are making no money that have amazing quality, and there are companies that are making a lot of money that have amazing quality, and then vice versa. That there are companies that are making no money that have bad quality, and there are companies that are making a lot of money that have bad quality. And I think that of course the ideal is you're both efficient, which is the driver of the profitability metrics, and effective, which is the result of the clinical outcomes and clinical process and outcomes. And I think that's where we need to go with benchmarking data, because I do think we would see a pretty wide variability across those metrics. But that was the aha for me. Holding certain things fixed, the variability is massive.
Can I
so this is a really
add
critical
one thing
point,
to
Lani,
the just add one thing to the
yeah, please, Rohit.
So the first part of what Lani was saying, I think about the variability of the operational metrics. there's some takeaways from that. One is that it means opportunity, right? I mean, if there is that much variability, that means the folks that are doing less well have a massive opportunity to improve. And then the other thing, which leads to most surveys as well, I think, is, being able to identify what the folks that are in the top quartile are doing versus folks that are in the bottom quartile, right? I mean, so what you want, other than just giving metrics by which people measure themselves, you want a guide map in terms of how they move from the bottom to the top. And I think that would be pretty powerful, and certainly something that we want to think about in the future.
Well, I think I absolutely agree. This idea too of like incorporating clinical quality, which frankly, like it is gonna, I would hypothesize shows at least as much variability as reimbursement rate distribution and profitability. And I'm going to call it out now. I think our field, frankly, is scared about publishing this kind of data, right? Because I mean, think about what that says. If a payer looks at it and says, companies at this level of average reimbursement rate are actually spitting out high quality, highest quality programs and are helping like change kiddos' lives. What are they doing? To your point, Rohit, what are they doing? What behaviors are they engaging in? And like, what's the guide map of their clinical programs? And I think that's part of what's going to contribute to reimbursement rate erosion over time. Or maybe, let me say the flip side, those who can describe their clinical outcomes and clinical quality and what they do for clients are going to be able to carve a moat around reimbursement rates. That feels really important. So yeah, highlighting this data is critical. But Rohit, what were some of the other key findings and maybe your aha moment?
Yeah, for me, the aha moment as well was, if you look at the data and you impute profitability to those metrics, so this is once again looking at the clinical manager pyramid, right? I mean, what would you estimate the break-even gross margin would be? It would sound like 25 to 30%-ish, right? And based on the data, that would indicate that at least half of the respondents were either break-even or losing money, which to me was an aha moment. It says, okay, this is an industry that is in trouble, right? I mean, like, you can't have half the participants. And I totally get that these were relatively smaller companies, and as you're bigger, you might have some scale economies coming to play. But for a lot of the smaller companies, it was a pretty grim, outcome. And so for me, that was the aha moment, and that was an important takeaway. The other was that, if you apply that same kind of measure and you see the delta between second quartile, so median, and third quartile, there's a pretty big jump in performance. And that's, would make me feel pretty optimistic, which then points to, okay, so what are the things that people should focus on to try and do better, right? I mean, the clear winner is the economics. Right. I mean, that's the most highly correlated, at least from this data, a small data set, albeit, that was the one that was the most highly correlated to performance, and specifically for BTs, right? So the reimbursement to wage ratio for BTs and the correlation with profitability was very high. The other areas where it was very high was productivity, both for BTs and for supervisors. And to me, that's a pretty big opportunity, because that is something that as an owner-operator or an operator or a manager, you have a lot more control over. So if you can get a handle on that, you can get that much closer to viability or healthier profitability. So those were some of the takeaways for me.
Rohit, this idea of like, I'm flabbergasted, frankly, that this finding of at least half of practices were either break even or losing money. Like, what do you think was driving that? Is this like COVID related things? Is it, what's going on? Any sense?
Yeah, I mean, so that's certainly a factor, right? I mean, because this data is Q1 data for this year. The survey was February, March, so certainly is a factor. But understand as well that, we're talking about unit economics, right? So it's not pulling into effect growth, which, the pandemic has impacted. Certainly it has impacted certain operational aspects. So without a doubt, a factor, but I still feel that a huge opportunity for improvement. And I think part of the thing is that we're a relatively new industry, right? And we're an industry where the typical leader of a company, is a BCBA clinician, superb at that part of their job, but still oftentimes on a learning curve with regard to the business aspects of things. And that's just learning or trainings or coaching. And I feel that, it is feasible or attainable. And I think, combining those two things would help things a lot. So I think that's one factor other than the pandemic. And then, and we should talk about this later, I certainly feel that this is an industry that is challenging to scale rapidly in a healthy way, from a viability point of view. But obviously, since we were talking about smaller companies out here, that probably didn't come into play. So I'd say, yeah, pandemic was a big factor. And I think the other thing is that, yeah, we have a little maturing to do as business operators.
Lani, for an ABA owner listening in today, who's struggling to achieve profitability, or at least their ideal level of profitability, whatever that is, like, talk me through how would they pinpoint like challenges to profitability in addition to some of the metrics that that y'all been describing, and what are some common ways that you've seen ABA practices successfully achieve profitability targets?
Well, so I think that, just reiterating what we just were talking about, benchmarking the sensitivity of specific decisions to profitability is the starting point, right? So, where are you with respect to behavior technician productivity? Where are you with respect to caseload size and productivity of your clinical supervisors? Where are you with respect to the clinical span of control or responsibility for your overhead positions, leadership? So benchmarking those things to understand where an organization sits, and then understanding the sensitivity of those measures so that they can address the ones that are weighing them down the most. That creates focus. And then it's about process engineering, right? It's about digging into it and saying, okay, they may come into a decision process with, I don't want to do anything that negatively impacts culture or clinical quality. So I need to make those fixed. And if I'm happy with my culture and I'm happy with my clinical quality, I don't want to make any changes that is going to degrade that. However, the current performance of this metric over here is unsustainable. So I have to problem solve and I have to go through and look at how I'm doing something today, how I can be more effective and efficient at doing that thing such that I maintain my culture and maintain my clinical quality, but I gain efficiency. And so I think just doing that systematic analysis and deciding where to focus is probably the highest, use of a leader's time in trying to attack it. The other piece is training, right? Like it's a people organization, and so as you do those process changes in order to not impact culture or to make sure you don't impact clinical quality, you got to bring people along. You have to teach them the fundamentals of the underlying, economic issues or impact issues, so that they're part of the team in that problem solving. And that's all about training and bringing your team along and not being afraid to have an honest conversation with people about what sustainability means or what efficiency really means. And I think that that's powerful as a leader to be able to say, look, we've got some challenges that we need to solve together. We all value these things. We've got to make progress on these things. Let's figure out what our options are. Let's do some pro-con analysis, and let's make some change in order to get to sustainability together.
I think it's deeply insightful, Lani, because it's this idea of like, let's look at data, right, and talk out loud with our teams about what we're seeing in the data and how we then empower them, because we can't just get to profitability by fiat, right? By calling out this, now we're going to be profitable. This idea of like, by pinpoint, looking at the data and benchmarking yourselves, pinpointing where you have process improvement opportunities or whatever it is, and then bringing your team along is such sage advice. Rohit, I want to I've heard you describe, this comes back to this idea of like profitability, but for ABA practices, profitability is just not a luxury. And just tell me more. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, I mean, it's as we were talking about, right? I mean, we haven't reached, well, for a lot of companies, if you're not making money, right, it's hard to have the conversation that's focused solely on clinical quality, because at that level you're not going to survive another year, and you're not doing anyone a good service by being that company that exits, and your team members have to look for jobs, and your clients have to look for new providers. That doesn't do anyone a service. And I think we're just at that stage where we have to be operationally efficient, increasingly so that we can become more viable. And so it can't be a one or the other conversation, right? I mean, like, the clinical quality has to also be lockstep with operational efficiency and financial viability. That's basically what I meant there.
Yeah, no, I think Jonathan,
I just want to
use in conversation
Lani was making.
Yeah, Jonathan, you've used in conversation with me the term default alive, right? And if an organization is not default alive a year from now or 2 years from now, they have to make change. I mean, like, there's no other option. As much as we would love to have other options, if you're not going to survive, you got to change somehow, or you close, or you just decide to throw in the towel. So.
Yeah, absolutely. It's and I think as hard as COVID has been the last 2.5 years, one bright spot has been that there are federal funding programs, right? The SBA's Economic Injury Disaster Loan Program, the PPP rounds, there's ARPA most recently. And so it's provided this cushion. And by the way, those programs were only available to non-private equity backed independent practices, which I'm not sure people appreciate. So so there's almost like, hey, we can operate at a not profitable level because we've got all this other funding coming in. That funding has all dried up now. And so I think that's part of what comes back to this idea. Profitability is just not a luxury anymore.
Yeah. I completely agree with that. I do think financing and funding losses is going to be harder and harder. That goes back to the interest rate and inflation point. Cost of capital is just going to go up. And so if an organization is not producing positive cash flow, it will become harder and harder to fund losses. And so I think that's one thing that people need to understand. And I think they do. They're feeling it now.
Oh, 100%. And I mean, that's a good pivot point to, man, there's just been so much press recently on LinkedIn and social media and elsewhere about layoffs at large national ABA providers, right? LME, Card, I think I just recently saw Florida. There are these others. Lani, are these like one-offs, or do you see them as part of like the secular trend in our field?
I think Rohit alluded to it. The estimate was that the field lost money in 2021 as a field. So if that is last year, and now people are facing more uncertain times, higher cost of capital going into 2022 and 23, then they have to take action to reduce cost. What I love so much about the people in this field is how focused they are on people, right? And the human condition generally. And so when I read these heartbreaking LinkedIn posts, it is heartbreaking. And I think that but I do think it's not just big organizations. Those are the ones that get the press. There are plenty of small organizations that have had to tighten their belts and will have to tighten their belts as well. And I think that it's a little bit, if the criticism is really waged at just the private equity world or those kinds of things, I think that that's a little misguided. That's not where these decisions are being made. It's across the board and it's macroeconomic. The thing that I would say, though, is in a field where it's all about people, it's all about how a leader navigates that tough decision that ultimately matters. And I think there's plenty of room for evaluation and criticism of people who have chosen to make those decisions and not done the right thing to support their team members finding new opportunities, or with some runway so that they can find new opportunities. And the way that they communicate and treat people says a lot about the culture and values of an organization when the tide is going out, right? So it's not that it just is that leaders have to make really, really terrible decisions sometimes that probably none of them really want to be making. But how they make it, how they plan for it, how they communicate it, what they do in support of their teams, I think that is absolutely something that should be evaluated and criticized. And so people should vote with their feet to be in organizations that treat people the right way.
Yeah, let me pile onto that because this is something that I get fired up about. But for any practice, I mean, sometimes layoffs are just inevitable, but we have so much guidance as a field on what it means to ethically discharge a client, right? I mean, we've got BACB ethical standards. We've got the BHCOE accreditation standards that clearly specify. We have the CASP, the ASQ autism standards on quality that clarify this. And so I can't emphasize more strongly that for any practice who's considering having to discharge clients, and certainly if you're laying off team members, like just go with the best practices that are already outlined and put your families first and foremost, because these are devastating events that happen.
Yeah. Which then says, don't wait till the very last minute till you have no resources to make that decision. That's actually not supportive of the people who are going to be impacted by it. Be out in front of it, make the decision early so that you still have some resources that you can deploy to supporting team members in that transition, versus you're on your last nickel and all of a sudden everybody's out the door or something like that. And we've seen that happen in the field through some of these cycles over the last 12 or 14 years. Some people may remember the organization Wellspring back in, I think it was maybe 2010 timeframe, that closed shop and locked the doors, and families were without services and people were without jobs overnight. Obviously, that's the example of how not to do it. But there have been these examples of different companies that have done it well, and when they've had to make tough decisions, and then these companies that have not done it well. And I think that's what should be evaluated and criticized.
Well said.
Yeah, and
to
also
be very clear, like the role of CEO. Go for it, Rohit.
No, go for it.
CEOs, one of the primary roles, the fiduciary responsibility to an organization. I say CEO, but executive director or whomever is leading an organization, is you have your eye extraordinarily close on your cash runway. And a lot of CEOs should always be thinking, like, how am I shoring up my balance sheet? How am I accessing additional capital? Not just for what I'm going to need, to your point, Lani, like next week, but what am I going to need over the next few months? And then, let's do some like risk management planning and ask questions about those unexpected black swan events. What am I going to need in 6 months, therefore? And then what am I going to need a year from now? And then how much cash needs to be parked on my balance sheet? I think one good rule of thumb is have at least 3 months of payroll expenses that sit in your bank so that you can weather through those harder events. But Rohit, I want to turn to you and do you have thoughts on layoffs? Because you and I have survived in a couple different AT Kearney and then Savvy Technology, where we both worked in Silicon Valley, survived layoffs. Or I should probably say, I think you totally protected me from those layoffs. But are layoffs the last resort? We're always taught in business school, or is there some other function that they serve?
Well, and there's a funny story out there with regard to you and I, Jonathan, that's probably worth retelling. But before going there, I just want to, so this conversation about private equity investments, maybe there's a distinction lacking a question, but maybe the element situation is a little different from let's say, the private equity-backed companies, because LME is a venture-backed company, and there was certain other dynamic. Well, one is just the behavior of a venture-backed company and what they strive to do, versus also the backing, which might have made that situation a little bit more distinct, i.e. they're much more likely to charge ahead with, pushing growth and unit economics to the gross margin level, but with high kind of like investment in tech and, SG&A and those kinds of things. So from a bottom line perspective, far less likely to be profitable in the early years. And their backer, SoftBank primarily, is in a world of hurt right now, right? I mean, massive losses, and a lot of it is just to do with what's happening in the venture capital back world, the VC world. So yeah, very different. But one of the interesting questions out here is, it's not as if we're going to stop private equity investors coming in and acquiring companies, right? And for any contract you need at least two signatures, right? So for every private equity buyer, there's also a seller that's selling to them. You're not going to stop either side's making that decision. And so if there's guidance to be provided, I guess it's guidance to choosing the next company you work for, right? And what's certainly true is that if you're management in a private equity-backed company, you have a little less say in terms of the bigger outcomes than if you are an owner-operator. And so choosing the right private equity-backed company to work for, I think, is a pretty important thing, and that goes down from management to other team members. Maybe that's the main takeaway, because you're not going to stop this from happening. What's also true is that I think there was a time when private equity companies saw this, massive growth opportunity, and that still exists, right? And that's what drove them there. And you had lots of acquisitions at very high premiums. And then the realization, which is happening now, or has happened, is that, it's a tough industry. It's a tough industry to scale rapidly and still kind of maintain profitability. So a little less, the ardor has cooled a little. So we are going to see less investment. So maybe that'll make some people happy. And, given those circumstances, a little less in terms of maybe the layoff aspect continues. So I want to pause, because I just added something to that conversation that you guys may agree or disagree with, and then go back to your question, Jonathan.
Annie, what are your thoughts?
Everything you just said, you're talking about the different flavors of capital and the contingencies that those backers face, and the contingencies that the leadership teams face. And I would say, most of the private equity investment, a substantial amount of it, occurred before this substantial shift in the complexity that occurred with the Great Resignation and with the labor challenges. So what someone might have evaluated the operating model for an ABA company to be very people intensive and therefore a little bit challenging. Now it's massively more challenging than it was, 3 or 4 years ago. And my sympathy and empathy and heart goes out to all of the people running independent ABA companies or large private equity backed companies. Their jobs got a lot harder over the last 2 years. So I think that's a big piece of it.
ABA practice owners, are billing and insurance issues getting you down? Well, let me tell you, Element RCM is your answer. Element provides world-class revenue cycle management services, contracting, credentialing, authorizations, billing, and more. Element's your partner, so you can focus on what you love to do, providing the highest quality services to your families and clients. Element's a preferred partner of the Behavioral Health Center of Excellence, and its founders have nearly 20 years of experience owning and operating successful ABA organizations. They understand you. They know that every dollar counts, that integrity is everything. Element works with any practice management system, and Element's not a vendor, they're your partner. So find out more and take a free revenue cycle assessment at elementrcm.ai. So, Lani, how would you describe the difference between private equity and venture capital?
There are different flavors of capital that invests in businesses, and they typically focus different stages of the development of a business and somewhat different goals. So venture capital investors are typically earlier in the lifespan of a company. They're looking to invest in an organization that is innovating or disrupting a field or something fundamentally new that has a very, very large, medium and long-term market opportunity, but is making big bets. So they're willing to invest a lot in technology. They build teams ahead of profitability, those kinds of things. And they typically don't use any debt. So all of the capital in the business is investing and trying to build that innovation. Private equity investors typically invest in organizations that have longer track records, that have proven the economic model and profitability, where the investment of the capital is geared towards accelerating growth or increasing the profitability on top of what's already proven, or a combination of the two. Oftentimes, because the business is more mature and has positive cash flow, they will use some debt in the capital structure, and that's sustainable and acceptable because the business has a proven track record of profit. So these are typically just two different visions of the investment, which is interesting. Most of the investment in our field has been traditional private equity because they're investing in businesses that have been around for 5, 10, or 15 years and have proven that they can make money in the past. Whereas LME is a little bit of a different investment. SoftBank is a venture capital investor and is investing in the vision that LME has around technology innovation, and that being the scaling factor for rapid growth, almost the marketplace point that was being discussed before with the eBay and Amazon. So I think those are just the two differences. Early stage, more focused on innovation. A little bit later stage, more focused on sustainable growth and profitability in the private equity world.
Well said. And private equity tends to be much more risk averse than venture capital, to your point around VCs investing in potentially these like longer term and industry disrupting kinds of technologies. Private equity is investing in businesses that are going concerns. They're bringing debt to fund those acquisitions, which means they have to service that debt. They have to pay for it, right? And so there's just, I appreciate you clarifying how these are so different. And Lani, like you were one of the most values aligned leaders I have ever worked for. You get it in terms of translating like a vision and the values of a business and an organization into the day-to-day behaviors that it takes to make that organization successful and make it be called the values aligned organization. But so like there's so much vitriol in our field right now around PE, and it feels to me like there's just some more nuanced issues at play that I don't think our field appreciates. And as an example, if it had not been for private equity funding, there would not be nearly as many kiddos with autism served, because there would not be as much building of BCBA residency programs, of expanding into new areas to make sure new kiddos and new states and markets to make sure new other kiddos get services. So there's nuance here, but like, what's at the root, you think, of this negativity?
I think that it's multi-factor, but there is private equity firms manage money, right? Their contingency is to invest money to make more money on behalf of their LPs. And so I think it's easy to just say, therefore, that's the only contingency that they ever care about, and they don't care about the quality of their services or the culture that they build. And in our field, because we're so people-centered, and that's such an important value in the field, that feels like a disconnect. I think that oversimplifies the contingencies for the investor, because long-term value and even medium-term value is created by creating sustainable, high-performing organizations, and that's all about the people. So it's not that there is a single-threaded contingency, but I think our field sometimes oversimplifies it and says, oh, all private equity cares about is money. Well, the path to making money is having a healthy organization and having the ability to recruit and retain people, and to be able to then deliver excellent services, because if the service quality is bad, then that's not going to build a good business, and those kinds of things. So I think it's a little bit of an oversimplification. And I think that the field, the independent providers have struggled just as much as everyone else. So we may, from a human tendency, look to blame something that's recent as the issue why I'm feeling that pain, so I think that those factors cause people to want to blame private equity investment. I've talked about this a couple different times over the last several years at different conferences and given presentations on this. Capital is neither good nor bad. It's what the organization does with that capital, how they lead and how they deploy it, that will in the wash come out as having been good or bad. And that's all about, leadership, and it's about execution. And that, I think, is really important. And the unambiguous good that you just mentioned over the last 5-10 years has been a massive expansion of capacity to serve families with autism. And that is all about the capital that has been invested into the field to enable that expansion of capacity. And so there are hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of more families who have access to services today who did not 10 years ago or 15 years ago. That has been enabled by investment in the field. So I think I understand the human dimension of wanting to have a villain in what's happened over the last several years, but I think it oversimplifies it. And I think there's unambiguous good and with respect to investment. And now it's okay. Now we need to continue to evolve. We have to create other contingencies. We have to get to the point that accreditations really matter and mean something. We have to get to the point that there is objective measurability of structure, process, and outcome measures in our field, because ultimately that is what should be the litmus test of whether an organization is doing the right thing or not doing the right thing. And and the problem is it's impossible to know. I've never met an organization, whether big or small, that doesn't think they are the best. And the reality is there's no objectivity to that measurement. And that's what we've got to get to.
So powerful, Lani. I think my personal mission with all this, it's easy to virtue signal around villains. And to your point, like, I totally get it. Our field is hurting now. And I would hope that translating that level of vitriol into a productive energy toward describing what you just said is having accreditations that are meaningful, that help us think about objective measures of quality. And then we should be demanding, no, not fucking screaming right now as a field for outcomes measures. That's the most important thing we can do to then objectively say this organization, whether PE-backed or independent, I don't give a shit, is serving kiddos more effectively than the next organization. And frankly, that's what our families deserve, right? They need to be able to say, this is the right ABA provider for me, and this is not. Oh, and I can be told in one sentence by each provider why they are better or why they're better for my family. So this is the stuff that gets me fired up. And I am I am going to take responsibility for leading a productive energy push toward the things that are important that our field needs over these coming 5 years.
For the listeners on this one, my case in point on this one would be, assuming that an organization that has high productivity is not providing good quality, I would suggest is not a good assumption. I suspect all of the leaders that are running ABA practices, big or small, would be able to point to a BCBA who was among their most productive BCBAs, who also had the best quality and the best relationships with families and the best relationships with their RBTs. And they did it with a smile and they never broke a sweat. And you've, I'm sure, seen the flip side, which is somebody who is a BCBA who grinds and really is trying to do good quality work, but it never seems to quite get there or never gets done. And they don't have great relationships with families and they don't have great relationships with their staff. And so assuming that productivity is counter to quality, I think is a false choice. I think that what the underlying factor is analyzing why is that clinician who's incredibly productive and incredibly high quality, producing incredibly high quality work. How are they doing it? And then train everybody else to do that, to behave in the same way. And I think that's where I think the big picture, one versus the other are false choices.
Yeah. Well, the two of you have recently partnered to start Bixpli, an advisory services organization for mid-sized and larger ABA practices. So Rohit, what was the need that you saw in the field that made you want to start Bixpli?
Yeah, it was connected to the survey, or at least the same thinking, which is this is an industry that is rapidly growing, provides a lot of great value to a lot of families, but also, to a large extent, smaller to mid-sized companies that do have this need for operational and business expertise, which I thought was a gap that was necessary. And yeah, it's to provide that. I really have a passion for working with smaller companies versus larger ones, and helping them get up that path to being operationally efficient is something that's near and dear to my heart. So that was a prime motivator for me.
Lani, what was your vision for Bixpli?
It's a lot of what Rohit just said. I think that there are opportunities to help small practices and maybe large ones too, to dig into some of these things based on experience. I've now had this experience over 14 years in two different relatively small then scaling organizations that we have acquired and we have built organically. We've built clinical systems, we've built training systems. So I think that experience base maybe can be helpful to people to apply to their own challenges. And so I think Bixpli gives us a platform to be able to work with people to help them to overcome some of the challenges that we've been talking about. I think in the longer term, it may evolve into some specific products in business intelligence, dashboarding, performance measurement and management, or those kinds of things that may become more recognizable products. But we'll see where that goes. Today, it's really meeting people where they are and helping them to solve the problems that they perceive, or helping them to understand the problems that they don't perceive yet, and helping them to fix them. That's fun. It's great to work with amazing people, which is this field is full of.
That's exactly right. And gosh, the moment that you've got a business intelligence solution, please call me. This is one of those things, just like availability of data for a field that is so data rich. Availability of the data that informs metrics critical to running our business, it just feels really lacking. So we'll make sure to drop a link in the show notes to Bixpli. So let's go to our start stop segment. Let's begin with Lani. What's one thing every ABA business owner should start doing? And then we'll go to you, Rohit.
I find that a question really hard to answer, because of course it depends on what they are not doing, that they should, the one thing, because everybody's going to be a little bit different. I think that the most important things are, one, make sure that you are taking care of yourself, that you are, leadership is lonely and challenging, and have a group of mentors and support systems outside of your business that you can get support from and take care of yourself if you are not doing that. Obviously the other side is the most important thing in an ABA practice to start doing, if you're not doing it systematically, is clinical competency and quality. You've got to figure out how to systematically measure clinical competency and quality, because every other decision should be with the assumption that we maintain and improve clinical quality and competencies of our teams as we make these other choices that we've been talking about with respect to operating paradigms and processes and productivities. So if you're not measuring it systematically today, you need to start.
Yeah, well said, Lani. And I think one thing implicit in there in systematically measuring quality is, yes, an individual BCBA or clinical director or CEO might be looking at an individual kiddo and saying, awesome, that child is making the gains that the life-changing gains we expected. And you've got to be able to pivot one level up and look at that quality across your entire organization. And this becomes like acceleratingly important. As you're in a growth mode, which many ABA practices are, and as you have more people. Lani, what's one thing ABA providers should stop doing?
I think that it's important that leaders don't obsess over the things that they can't control and focus on the things that they can control. So stop obsessing over things that, you can't, that are not within your control. Focus on the things that are within your control and then go take action on them.
Powerful, dude. Rohit, any thoughts on what ABA providers should start and stop?
I think the thing that providers should start obsessing is that we need to really train our supervisors up, right? I mean, it's not just the management and the clinical directors, but our supervisors as well. So empower them with information, empower them with leadership roles, because this is an awfully hard industry to thrive in without that. So I would suggest this obsess on that.
Well, where can people find each of you online? Lani, let me go first.
I'm on LinkedIn, so you can find me. Just search for Lani Fritts, and the guy that used to run Cadence and Trumpet and now Bixpli. And I love to connect with people on LinkedIn, so that would be one place. Or anybody can send me an email at any time, and the new email is lani@bixpli.com. So that's not really online, but if they want to reach out to me, that's a great way to do it. lani@bixpli.com.
Awesome. I know you are always open to having conversations with others in our field. Rohit?
Yeah, similarly for me, LinkedIn, and the email address is Rohit, that's ROHIT @bixpli.com, BIXBLI.com, and we have a website forthcoming soon. We're a little slow on this one, but it'll happen.
Right on. I will drop those in the show notes. So are y'all ready for the hot take rapid fire questions?
I'm glad it's rapid fire. Though, if I have the chance, I do have to give that one anecdote about you and I and layoffs. I never got a chance to do that. So let me just say it. I think you should do it right now, Rohit. What was that?
I think you should do it right now, Rohit.
Yeah, no, let's do it. And if I drop off, then Lani will answer my top X whatever the rapid fire questions. So Jonathan and I go back a long ways, right? So to the late 1990s is where I'm guessing. So this is a company called A.T. Kearney, and then I moved to the Bay Area because everybody was. It was like, everyone was moving to the West to unearth some gold and tech companies, and I moved here. And because I'm so much in awe and love of Jonathan, I wanted him to join us as well. And he had left Kearney at that point in time, Jonathan, if I remember correctly, and you'd moved back to Virginia. And so we made an offer, and Jonathan said yes, super happy. Got onto his car. He decided to drive from Virginia to the Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area. And I don't know where you were in that drive when I had to give this really terrible piece of information. It was one of the harder phone calls I made. Savvy decided to do a layoff. And Jonathan was one of the people laid off. And I tried to not to happen, but it happened. And it was a tough conversation to have. And but I think we gave you pretty decent severance. Not bad for like 0 days of effort, right? I guess. And you moved to the Bay Area, and sooner or later we were able to get you back in, and you made me look good after that. We thrived. So
yeah. We did thrive. It went on to like an extraordinary another 3 years that we got to work together. So that you're spot on with that, Rohit. And the ad I have is that I think I got the call around Christmas Eve. I was heading out west. Fortunately, it was about a month and a half later that I was able to come and join y'all. What's funny about that, and this was like the tech bust, right? Right around the tech bust in 2000, exactly. Which has a lot of parallels to sort of what's happening now, macroeconomics. But you know what's the funniest part about that is, I don't know if y'all remember the movie Friday, which is, I think, just one of the funniest movies of all time. But there's this line in there because he gets like fired on his day off, and his buddy says like, "You got to be one dumb motherfucker to get fired on your day off." So literally to this day, as I like talk to others about it, that was me. Like, I had to be one dumb motherfucker to get fired on my day off. But that brings back wonderful memories. So yeah, let's do the hot take. Rohit, you go first for each of these, and then Lani. So you're on your deathbed. What's the one thing you want to be remembered for?
Well, it's like, I guess, a little selfish. I would want to be remembered as somebody who was a good father to my daughter. That's super important to me.
You are a good father to your daughter. I think of you in your life that way.
Oh, thank you.
For what it's worth.
You need to talk to my daughter, I think.
How about you, Lani?
I have the same answer. You know, I think that for me, what's most important to me are my three kids and my wife, my relationship with my wife, and my relationship with them. And so I want to be remembered as a good father and husband, and not just good, oh, he's a good guy, supportive and enabling of their success. And I think that is all about being kind and teaching values. And so I hope that that's what I'm remembered for, is instilling in them a value system that carries forward.
And to everyone that knows
What's your
Lani,
most important
they know that he has a great family. So
amen to that. Rohit, what's your most important self-care practice?
Right now it's eating my vitamins and making sure I take a morning walk, which, you know, typically doesn't end up being a morning walk, but sooner or later I'll drag my sorry ass outside and get my dose of vitamin D.
Right on. How about you, Lani?
I would say exercise. I love playing golf, which I don't really consider exercise, but I love the walk and the flow exercise, you know, focusing on something like that. I'd also say, you know, I love playing music, and those things are what gives me energy and, you know, in life.
Yeah, there was a fantastic, I think it was in 2012, a strategic planning actually gathering of teams across Trumpet in California. And there was a jam band session, and sure enough, Lani was up there jamming with the best, a guitar player consummate. Speaking of which, what's your favorite song? Start with you, Lani.
I find this impossible to answer because my musical taste spans every genre and every, you know, period in time for the last 70 years. So I don't really have a favorite song. The last podcast I did, I was learning the song "Weight of Lies" by the Avett Brothers at the time, and so I guess I'll give the same answer just because I think it's a pretty song. It's fun to play, and I think it has a strong message about being authentic and honest. So I'll say that.
Nice.
Yeah, this is a tough question. So push comes to shove, maybe I'll just say Imagine by John Lennon. But I will ask you guys a question too. Favorite movie?
Easy. Anything by Christopher Nolan. The Prestige, which is a little less well known, is the most beautiful and disturbing and sort of mellifluous but cognitively dissonant character study of two magicians. It's Hugh Grant and who was Dark Knight Batman, whatever his name was, Christian Bale. And if you haven't seen it, go see it. It blew my mind so far wide open. I'm still recovering 2 years later.
I shared that one with my kids about 3 years ago, and my son was only 9. And I think I think talking about mind blowing and maybe freaking out might be an appropriate way to describe it. That's a good one. I don't know an answer to that one either. I love movies. I love different genres, and maybe Iron Man because it's super entertaining.
Totally.
Well, it almost seems that you planned for me to ask that question, Jonathan, given your response. So well articulated. I mean, you didn't. I just asked this. But I mean, and maybe the two of you don't really care, but my favorite movie is The Matrix.
Also mind expanding. In a way that I think if someone hadn't seen the original, is watching the current one would be like, okay, maybe that's cool or maybe not. But that transformed how special effects and movies happen.
Right. And you know, that movie, interesting enough, has not aged badly at all. I mean, like it came out in what, 2000? And you watch it now and the special effects still look good and the story still holds together and it's still really cool. I watched that with my daughter and had to pause and rewind every now and then, but she really liked it.
Same here. I recently watched it with my 11-year-old son and he loved it. It stands the test of time. So the funny anecdote on this story, I thru hiked the Appalachian Trail back in 2000 between my time at Kearney and Savvy. And so I was about 3 months in, came off the trail. It actually was like hanging with some friends and we turned on The Matrix. So imagine like 3 months of basically sensory deprivation and then watching not just a movie, but that movie where Keanu Reeves is literally like pivoting his body like he's a combination of Gumby and freaking Superman. I didn't know what to do with myself. It was so well said, Rohit. What's if you give yourself your 18-year-old self one piece of advice, what would it be, Lani?
Always be honest. I think that's again, it's sort of cliche. But as you get older, as I've gotten older, rather, I have come to appreciate how much more important it is to just be kind and direct, and honest. And I put those two things together: kind and honest, rather than either being worried what somebody thinks about you or your capability or your answer or whatever. I think it's so important as a foundation to trust and authenticity in life.
How about you, Rohit?
Yeah, for me, it's probably going to be more confident. I mean, all of us to varying extent are plagued by self-doubt. And as you get older, you realize that, not everybody's an expert. And, you put in a little bit of effort, learn some stuff, and you can provide a lot of value. So, be more confident. That'll be mine.
All right. And finally, if you could only wear one style of footwear, Lani, which would it be?
Flip-flops for sure.
Damn it, Lani. That's what I was going to say. Yeah, flip-flops.
That's why we're partners.
We have Flip-Flop Friday.
You can't go wrong. I'm going to start doing that, Rohit. Flip-Flop Friday. Hey, gentlemen, this has been a pure honor and pleasure. Thank you for sharing your wisdom with our field and with me.
Jonathan, thanks for doing this podcast and thanks for inviting us to be part of it. You're producing some really high quality content for people to consider, and I really appreciate being part of it.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you very much. It's always a pleasure. And I also feel like I need to give an explanation for the glass of wine I had. And it's 10 o'clock, 10:09 where I am. So that's my 10:09 in the evening where I am.
PM.
Excuse me. Yeah. Yeah. I should have left it at that. 10:09.
That's true. Rohit is recording live from Delhi, India, after having been awake for more than 24 hours flying over. So, Rohit, thanks for being with us. Take care, fellas.
Take care. Thanks. Bye.
What up, listeners? Hey, I got something for you. If you like my Building Better Businesses in ABA podcast, you're going to love the Behavioral Observations podcast with Matt Sikoria. So I recently met Matt at ABAI, and let me tell you, I was just an instant fanboy. Matt's the real deal. His pod is all about stimulating talk for today's behavior analysts. So session 191 on his pod is on the behavior analysis of lying. That's right, lying. How awesome is that? Who does that? He also talks social skills, ACT, FAs, and so much more. His guests include Greg Hanley, Jonathan Tarbox, and other legendary names in our field. And as a BCBA, you can even get CEU credits through behavioral observations. You can find Matt and the Behavioral Observations podcast on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, or your favorite podcast channel. Enjoy, friends.
Thanks for listening to Building Better Businesses in ABA podcast. Stay tuned for our next exciting episode. In the meantime, please like, subscribe, share, and comment. We value your feedback. Don't forget to follow us on social media at elementrcm.ai.